Good morning on this fine spring day, although summer's coming soon, I'm pretty sure. So, welcome to our second breakfast meeting of 2016 here in Austin. I'm Ralph Hansen. I'm chair of our Austin Board of Advisors for our chapter, the Texas Tri-Cities chapter of NACD, and we want to welcome you and thank you for being with us. We also want to welcome and thank our sponsors who make all these programs possible, and we really have a very strong network here in Austin. But today, investor-driven boards. Our moderator, Bill Bach, will lead this panel in a discussion of every aspect of investor-driven board service. And then we'll have a Q&A with you, the audience. And on your tables, there are slips of paper. Jot your question down, hold the slip up. We'll come and get it and bring it to the panel. So that's the plan. Well, Bill Bach, our moderator, I think is known to most, if not all of you in this room. He's one of Austin's most distinguished business and community leaders. He's held pretty much every senior executive role imaginable at a variety of tech companies: Silicon Labs, Convex Computer, Tivoli, Dazzle, Texas Instruments. He's been a venture capitalist, and he's a highly experienced director of public and private company boards alike. I really can't imagine anyone better to lead us through this discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and the panel, and let's get going.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. And we should mention that this is Ralph's last session to host the entire event after a decade or so as being in charge of the NACD Tri-Chapters or Austin process. So, Ralph, thank you so much for all your time and service. I appreciate the introduction, Ralph, and it's my pleasure to introduce the other members of this panel. They are different in many respects. Rod more closely resembles me. He's been around Austin for a long time. I think, Rod, you and I first met.
You're like a son to me, Bill.
Yeah. I think we first met when you were at Media Prize, which is more years ago than we really want to admit. Rod then went on to a significant stint at Lombardi, which was a local software company that really had to be reinvented along the way, and ultimately very successfully sold in an acquisition to IBM. He has more recently been the leader and CEO of his new company, and Spreadfast, I think, has been a different experience in that this is a very exciting company in the social media software space that has grown like a weed and has accomplished a significant local acquisition, now achieving genuine scale, and is one of the most exciting software companies in the private space that we have here in Austin. Rod serves incrementally on a couple of boards. He's a director at Bypass Lane, at Perception Software, and he's on the board of the Austin Technology Council. So I think, both from the perspective of serving as a director and being the CEO of 3 different private companies where he had to manage investor-driven boards, Rod's in a very good position to offer insights on this topic. Kevin, by contrast, I met for the first time last night. He has the distinguished characteristic that, unlike Rod and I, he has demonstrated the ability to keep a job. He has spent his entire career up until very recently with Southwest Airlines, and entered the company in a marketing context and rose ultimately to the chief marketing officer of the firm. A company that most of us have lived our whole lives with here in Texas and would recognize as brilliant in the arena of marketing on every dimension, from hot pants forward. I think that Kevin's experience at Southwest led him to a board opportunity here in Austin that will also be one that you're very familiar with. He joined the board of HomeAway and had the opportunity to become an independent director at an investor-controlled board, witnessed the transition from private to public, and we'll touch on some of those aspects as well this morning. Kevin's currently on the board of a Sunnyvale, California-based company that is called Uplift, and the HomeAway board opportunity obviously disappeared with its recent acquisition. So to begin with, let me start with Rod and just ask in general, what really is the overall responsibility of a board that is privately financed? I mean, I think in NACD we get a lot of material and a lot of information about public company boards, and we get a lot of exposure to governance in the public environment. So, what really is different in a private company setting?
So I think governance has a lowercase g, probably, on a private board. I'm sorry, Melissa. My new chief legal officer is sitting right there. She's monitoring everything I say. It's getting bigger now. It's getting bigger now. It's still lowercase, but it's a way bigger font. I think the interesting thing about private boards is, especially if it's a venture-backed company, is the guys who put the money in sit on the board and they fight which hat they have on, whether they're an investor or they're a board member on a continuous basis. Typically, early stage private companies don't have independence in many cases. There's management and investors, and to me, step one is to try and get some independence on a private board that have experience with earlier stage investor-backed companies, right? So to sort of help manage through the challenges of having investor with two hats sitting on the board, or maybe three, in my case, three investors with two hats sitting on the board. But it's I also sit on the public board, Upland Software, which is a software company here that Jack McDonald took public a year and a half ago. Completely different experience, obviously. Even though we're about the same size companies, we're private, he's public. Completely different board constructs and activities, and obviously a lot more governance when you're public. But I think it's more of an operating board. You spend a lot of time on strategy. You spend a lot less time on governance, frankly, when you're little and you're private.
So, Kevin, talk a little bit about the transition from private to public at HomeAway and your experience there.
Sure. So when I arrived at HomeAway, they had already completed the public offering, so they were already public when I got there. But you could see that there was a lot of probably some of what Rod was just describing, and the board was trying to find its legs and how it was going to evolve into this new world, because the governance is definitely a capital G, and it's very, as a public company, and it's something that it's a big responsibility. And so that transition was interesting to work with and go through with the board as we became a public board and really governed like a public board and had the structure of a public board. So that transition, I think, was done very artfully at HomeAway, but I could see as a participant in that, where you could have lots of steps along the way where things could definitely go off the rails, and if you didn't have the right crew there with you.
Yeah, I have been through this transition a number of times, and it's a fascinating one. The private company board is clearly dominated by the investor board members because, frankly, they have ownership. And in most private company situations, management, founders have a minority stake, and it's the investors around the table who actually ultimately enjoy control. So they have a very strong influence on literally everything during the private company environment. In the transition to public, typically you want to begin to bring in genuine independent directors, and it's an evolutionary process because you need independent directors at the IPO, and ultimately you want to phase out the investor directors who no longer may have significant ownership interest in the company and need to really be replaced with independent directors who represent the broad shareholder base. I'm on the public company board of Silicon Labs, and at this time last year, we had 2 founders and 2 original investors still on the board of directors. And the company will celebrate its 20th anniversary this year. So, that transition is still going on as we speak, and it does occasionally take a really long time. So Rod, if you are a private company and you've got investor dominance on the board, why do you even look for an independent director? And what would be the motivation for those investors and the CEO to even consider someone of an independent character?
I think there's multiple reasons. The first one is that as a CEO who also sits on the board, it's good to have independents who can sort of act as a buffer in a lot of ways between the coalition of investor board members and perhaps the founders' leadership team. You just get a different voice around the table that's not, management has a tendency to optimize for company decisions, and investors have a tendency to optimize for individual share prices, not given share price, right? Everybody's in at a different place. And so I think, one, there's that opportunity to be an independent voice in the room. And then from a skill set perspective, we added, in my current company, we have 1 independent at the moment. We're in the process of adding a couple more. But we chose somebody because of their domain expertise as well. So this was a person who actually has a chief revenue background, a sales background, highly scaled in industries like ours. And so we brought on sort of industry expertise and independence and experience with private boards first. And then, and as we grow up, we're going to end up having to add, nobody on the management team or the investors ever want to chair an audit committee. So you have to go solve that problem. Actually, I'm not sure anyone ever actually wants to chair an audit committee, but we have to go solve that problem long term. And then, anytime you can add people from the domain, like we sell to these guys, right? So he would have been a classic customer for us. Right. So anytime you can add a senior executive from the domain you're doing business in is also, I think, really interesting just to help guide the company strategically.
Okay. Kevin, talk a little bit about what is an independent director and how does independence get defined, and what should a private company or an investor-led company look for in an independent director?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me tag on to what Rod was saying. I do think that balance is the balance of the voices in the room is really important, because anytime a business is complex, and so you have these really difficult issues often that you're discussing, and again, if your perspective is how can I make a buck today versus what's best for the business, you really do need that a little more balance to that discussion. So I agree that is a really key component of having an independent voice there who is helpful in navigating those discussions. As far as what defines an independent director, Melissa had a 14-page questionnaire I had to fill out every year that would tell me if I was independent or not, so she could probably provide that to you. But really, it's someone, I think, who is genuinely interested in representing the best interests of the shareholders and making sure the business is doing taking the proper path. Now, you may not always agree with the leadership team in the path, but that's okay as long as you feel like you have competency and that the decision is not a disaster. And so my focus on being on the board, and at Southwest I interfaced with our board, so I was on both sides of the board table, is really to pressure test the thinkings, the decisions, and make sure that that we were taking care of the business and the shareholders as best as possible. And that was really job one. And you also needed a little longer term perspective than just what's the quarter going to be, or what are we going to do today? How's my personal wealth going to accrue in today? So
Yeah. Actually, a scarcity of these roles in the market, because in numerous cases there will be no independent directors until the company really begins to prepare for a public offering. But there's also a standard that lots of term sheets that you see for financing will call for a couple of founders who are going to be on the board, the new investors are going to be on the board, and one independent director to be mutually agreed upon. That often comes about because there's an understanding that you've got relatively young, technically focused entrepreneurs as founders and financially focused investors, no one with extensive operating experience. And so, the goal of finding an independent director in that set of circumstances is to bring someone onto the board who can really be a coach or a guide to the CEO and the CFO in how to build this company. And I think that that's a common objective that both management and investors are looking for in terms of seeking out an independent director.
Bill, I think that's a great point, and I think if the parties, I think you nailed it in terms of how you described the founders and the investors, and as long as they're aware of their particular perspective, I think independence can be a tremendous value. Yeah. And I do think it's one of those that's unfortunately underutilized, because I think there's so much different perspective that can be brought to the discussion.
Okay.
So one quick thought on that. I sit on two, well now one, we just sold this other company, but two relatively small private company boards, and I'm the only independent on both. It's investors, CEO, and me. Mm-hmm. In both cases, frankly, it was because I think the CEO is fun to work with, and it's that coach relationship. And it's interesting to me that the questions, the value add of an independent in that situation ranges from, hey, I'm doing a financing, I got 3 new investor options, here are the term sheets, my inside guys have 9 different opinions on what I should do. It's sort of sorting out alternatives. It's everything from something that strategic to I get a text at 10 o'clock at night going, what's a typical comp for a VP of engineering? Right? So it goes from really strategic input to sort of almost tactical coaching. And it really is sitting in almost a mediator role between investors and management in a small private company. Yep. is a huge value proposition. And if I'm to anybody running a small private company, if you don't have an independent you can really trust that can help you, you're just missing out, I think.
Yeah. So you raise an interesting topic here, Rod, that has to do with what's a really commonly used phrase in public company boards, and that's the director's fiduciary responsibility. But let's talk about fiduciary responsibility in a private company investor-dominated board. For example, at the time you're going through a financing, when management is looking for the highest possible valuation to protect their equity position in the company, and the other guys on the board are actually going to be putting in the money. How does all that work?
So I think I've raised close to $200 million of venture in my career, and every time I've done it, it sucks. And that's going to make it on some YouTube video somewhere. But I've not been shy about saying that, so it won't surprise anybody. It is, especially when you have multiple inside investors that have come in at different times. So you've got a guy who walked in and paid $1 a share the day you opened the doors, and then you got a guy a year later who paid $4 a share, and then you got somebody who paid $8 a share. And you're bringing in a new investor who has his own opinion on valuation, and you've got the complexity of getting all those guys aligned. Right. And they all have different, they all have their own spreadsheets back at the office. They have different fund economics. They have different timing issues. politics in their own businesses. And so trying to keep an investor group aligned is really hard. I spend a lot of time doing that. I've got 4 investors in the business that have all come in at different times. They're all institutions, and they all have different goals and objectives, and some of them aren't in business anymore. they just are running the funds down, and some actually are much more aggressive in raising new funds. And so it's a complex dynamic to try and manage multiple investors. And then it's something as simple as let's have a strategic approach to comp. So if you guys sit on public boards, right, you think about long-term incentive stock option compensation. Well, in a private situation, typically you hire somebody, you give them stock options, and you never call them back, right? And because typically the life of a private company is not 7 years, so you don't get 100% vested. And just the simple conversation of, hey, we've got 52 people that are 82% vested, we need to change the option pool. When you have that conversation with an investor, it's coming out of their pocket. It's straight dilution to their ownership. But if you don't take care of the leadership or the stars in the business, you're going to lose. And so that's this whole, what's the right thing to do for the company, for the employees, for the leadership team to sort of win? Because if we don't win, none of us make any money, right? So you're sort of in that mode of, managing parochial behavior to try and further the business.
All right. Kevin, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think he nailed it. I think at the end of the day, all of our jobs, even investors, is to make the business successful. And so if we stay focused on that, I think, as Rod says, everybody wins that way. It's just hard to do when you're in the day-to-day and you're in the fight to necessarily think that clearly about it. But I think if you really can get that alignment with the team, and that is your fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah. It's very, very difficult. I mean, I think that Rod used the phrase at the start of this session, what hat is the director wearing, when they are an investor in the company. I'm guilty of being on both sides of this because I was a venture investor for 5 years, mostly have either been an independent director or a member of management. Kind of frankly, I don't see very many investor board members who ever wear more than one hat. and it's the hat of their firm. And it's understandable because in many respects, that director views service on that board as his job. That's part of what he's being paid to do by his fund. And he may have 5 or 6 similar roles, with other companies. And he's almost always thinking about what's in the best interest of my partnership or my fund. And very difficult for such a director to look at what might be in the interest of the company that is contrary to the interest of his fund. And as Rod points out, these different investors are in very different situations from time to time and have completely different views of what would be a successful outcome for the company. One may want liquidity today and absolutely needs it for something that is important to his fund. Others, may only want to swing for the fences and wouldn't possibly accept liquidity at anything less than a superordinary result. And those do get into conflict with each other as you run down the road.
But my last company that IBM acquired, we literally ended up, it was the perfect scenario because we were acquired as opposed to being sold. And it wasn't something we were planning to do at that point in time. But the deal that ended up on the table, when you look at the grand scheme of the market and the company and where we were, was a really good deal. And I had a venture investor in that company that was bound and determined to blow the deal up simply because he needed no liquidity. He was in a great situation. He was like, why don't we just keep rolling and see what happens, right? And so when every piece of data you could find relative to valuations and expectations of market size and growth rates, and said this is a really right answer. Still unwilling to take the hat off, right? So we ended up doing it anyway, because the good news is he didn't own enough shares to
stop it.
stop the deal. but it was, but you know, that happens, and you're scratching your head going, there's not a blade of logic in that sort of thought process. It's 100% individually driven on their situation, in their fund, in that moment, and you know, and many a good company has gotten taken down an alleyway or a rat hole because of a decision like that was super parochial.
So it is a place where the independent director can bring a lot of value by truly not having an invested interest in the outcome, and can look more broadly across what's best for everybody. So in Rick's summary for this session, there is discussion that leads me to believe that the group might have interest in being independent directors on private company boards. So let's turn to that for a moment and talk a little bit about, you know, if you have an interest to throw yourself into this briar patch, you know, how would you prospectively go about it? So, you know, Kevin, let's start with you.
I think it's like most things in business. You really have to start networking and get your name out there, and come to events like this, and just work hard to meet the people that would make that possible. Second thing is make sure you're taking care of learning as much as you can about business, being a director, corporate governance. That will make you a valuable candidate when you do find that connection that's looking for somebody. So it's and then I guess thirdly, there are firms and services that can help place you, and you know, connecting with them would be another option as well. But I think there's nothing like, you know, getting out and meeting people and expressing your interest and getting to know people and see if there's a good connection, good fit there.
Rod?
You know, look, I'm going through the process right now of figuring out which independents to add, and I think that if I think about, in my mind, how I think about that, it's relationship is really important. You know, it's like you have to take the oath, first do no harm, because it's hard enough for a leader to run a company and grow a company and manage a board. Adding an independent that doesn't make it easier is nonsensical. So why would I want to do that? So you want to add an independent that actually makes it easier, and that means somebody who they bring some unique expertise. They're collaborative. They're actually fun and interesting to work with. You know, I think there's a bit of an adage about. You want people who don't have time, right? Because then and really don't want to do it, in a way, which is sort of counter, because you really, if I need you, I need you. So you do really need to have time. Why is the independent doing this? What's in it for them? Is it some power trip? Hey, I want to be on a board so I can wield my opinions. You know, next, is it what's the objective of the director? So for me, it's sort of vertical expertise, and it's whether or not they can be a really functional, useful, active member of the board. So that means time. That means sort of the right personality, the right fit, a real collaborative person. That, you know, so that I think those are all traits that are really important to me when I try and find somebody.
Yeah, I think that networking is essential, because, you know, there's not going to become a match between a company and an independent director unless there's knowledge of each other. And I think that it goes in two dimensions. You know, one is it's nice to have a relationship with the CEO, because in many respects it's very unlikely that you're going to get invited onto that board if you don't. But it's similarly frequently necessary to have a relationship with the VCs, because they're also cautious to not want to put someone on a board that is going to become a problem for them. So becoming known in that community, private company investors and CEOs, is pretty important. But I think in some respects, private company independent director opportunities are driven by the company, and they find you. So if you've got a specific expertise in either management or industry that fits the need of a company, they're often looking. And if you're networked well enough that people know you would be interested, there's a chance that something like that could happen. So, if it does, when would you pass on an independent director opportunity?
Well, for me, first and foremost, the CEO is absolutely critical decision. You're going to be working with this person closely. They're leading the team and the company. And so if they're a knucklehead, then you do not want anything to do with that, no matter how glorious it may be. So that's the first thing that I look at. And then second thing is the other board members and the function, how highly functioning that board is. So if it's a dysfunctional mess, but you've got a great CEO, that's not going to be a really successful or enjoyable thing. And Rod alluded to it earlier. You want to enjoy working with people that you'll be spending quite a bit of time on this assignment. So having people who are not enjoyable or dysfunctional is something I would pass on. So, and then the third thing is, these are all really tightly kind of ranked very high, kind of 1A, B, and C, is the business. If the business is under stress and you've got a dysfunctional team, that's pass, because there's just too short to mess around with opportunities like that.
Yeah, I was on a board with Bob Bailey, who was the longtime CEO of PMC Sierra, and he kind of had it as succinctly as I had ever heard it. He says, "I'm too old to work with assholes anymore."
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, do a good job of due diligence on your own to find out if you really want to get into that mess.
Yeah.
Let's talk about board compensation. Public company boards, their compensation is in the proxy, very easy to go research and understand. What about in a private company? What have you seen as how you get compensated, why, and how does an independent director receive fees?
I buy you dinner, buy you drinks, pay for your plane, pay for your hotel. You get no cash, and I will give you some stock. And I promise you it'll be worth a lot more than it was when I gave it to you. That's how you compensate private directors. So don't ask me for a check. But I do think if you get into a private board, to the point of if you like the CEO and you have some expertise, and it's a market where you really believe the company can be successful and grow and create value. I think there are places where there's outsized upside in a private board situation, especially if you get in early enough, right, where you're early from a strike price perspective. But I mean, this is all my data points. I could be wrong here, but I think it's typically you win when the company wins.
Yeah. I think that's fair. In the classic Austin, Texas, private company board that is venture financed, the company's most likely in investment mode. Probably not yet profitable, taking investor dollars and spending it in research and development and sales and marketing expansion. So cash fees are very rare, and a director will get an equity stake. It's not insignificant. In my experience, market for a private company director can be from like 0.2 to 0.4% ownership in the company, which is at least equal to what a director level employee would be, and you're only working as a director. You're not there, every day, 60, 70-hour weeks. But on the other hand, the odds in venture capital, and a lot of these companies don't make it, and so you don't go seeking these boards or agreeing to do it in the private company setting with much of an economic motive. I think you really have to have a view of what can you contribute to the company, but I think equally importantly is what do you get back. My board service has suggested to me this is an incredible two-way street, and when you're on a private company board, you'll learn something every day or every meeting that pays back to your day job, and you get compensated for board service in ways that are different than economic and it can be very valuable. So I think we're basically at the stage where we can look for questions from the audience.
Yes, would you discuss one or two of the top liabilities that independent directors might face that they don't know enough to ask about before taking the job?
Mm-hmm. So I think if I can repeat the question you're asking about, what are the liabilities that a director can face? And we may have to have Melissa answer this question, but I can start. I mean, I think that from a legal point of view, directors do have liability, and they're very similar, frankly, between public company and private company boards. For me, one of the most important ones is a duty of care. If you're going to be a director and be responsible for other people's money, at some level you've got to invest the time to be professional about carrying out your responsibilities and really understanding the industry, understanding the company, investing enough time. You have a duty of care. I think additionally, you've got this fiduciary responsibility, or I guess as the lawyers call it, a duty of loyalty. And you really have to look for and avoid conflicts of interest and not get yourself in a situation where you're really at conflict with the interest of the company itself. So, Kevin, any?
Yeah, those would be the biggies. I would say, I think your first one was right on. When you're managing other people's money, or you're watching over other people's money, you just have to use common sense and avoid all the things that conflicts of interest, and make sure you are taking it seriously and doing your best to make it work. So, but yeah, Melissa could probably give us a list of 10 other ones. For me, it's no comparison. A ton more work to be on a private company. At least I'm the one I'm involved with is early stage, so they're leaning very heavy on the board members for help in networking and operating, really. So I'm spending a lot of time on that right now, and it was and then the public board that I was on, it would ebb and flow. Obviously, you had the standard meetings. But then there would be other events that would require off-cycle phone calls, or sometimes us getting together. So, but it was much more manageable than the private board I'm on.
I think it's if you look at stages, if you're little in private, then you would. If you're an independent on a small private, like your example, you're going on sales calls with me, right? We're like. You're part of the team,
yeah.
Right? You're not hanging out once a quarter and looking at the results. I don't have any sales or EP. I just spend money when I'm little. I mean, you can look and make sure we're spending money, right? So there's no earnings per share because there's no earnings because there's no revenue. So when you're little, I think it's a lot of time. Matter of fact, a lot of small boards meet monthly. And that's not atypical. And then I think when you get bigger private, it starts to feel a little bit more like a public board, but it's probably a little less onerous relative to governance, and you spend less time in audit committee meetings, and probably compensation committee meetings are easier. But so I think it's like a lot, and then it's maybe not as much, and then it gets a little harder if it's a public board. So I think it's more stage, not just public-private.
I mean, the public company board adds a bunch of SEC requirements that are incrementally work. And so you've got formal committees that have to be very rigorous in how they behave. Audit used to be incredibly difficult, not so much anymore. Compensation has become incredibly difficult. So, the public company environment adds SEC that you don't have in the private company world. But for me, the issue of time commitment is companies successful versus failing. The successful ones are simple. Whether they're public or private, if everything's going well, being a director is pretty smooth sailing. And everything changes when things go bad. And the directors end up really engaged and off-scheduled board meetings and all kinds of issues. And, it's often identified in the context of changing out a CEO who is not succeeding. And, that's sort of the fundamental responsibility of the board, private or public, is, you're responsible for who is the chief executive officer of the company. And if you've got a good one and everything's going well, your job's pretty easy. But when you're confronted with the need to change that CEO, it becomes very time-consuming.
There are some times when it's actually not a negative activity. It's about like you're selling the company, or you're trying to raise money, or you're preparing to go public, or that are more sort of spike activity times. Any sort of transaction that's going on, you're acquiring something, then there's a lot more activity.
So now we get a question that I have some trepidation about, because it's from the CEO of one of the companies where I'm on the board. So, Mark, go ahead.
Well, you might know where I was going, Bill. One of the things that's been absent from our conversation so far is the difference between a multi-venture backed board and a public board. In between is something called a majority-owned private equity board. You want to comment on the challenges and opportunities of being an independent director in that setting?
Are you trying to get me in trouble? I knew this was a loaded question. So Mark's the CEO of SailPoint, like Spreadfast, another one of the really exceptional private software companies in town, that went through an amazing financing transaction 18 months or so ago, where there could have very well been a change of control that would have put the company under a big public company umbrella like an IBM or CA or something of that nature. But instead, Mark's company was acquired by Thoma Bravo, a large private equity firm. For some reason or another, I had been the independent director at the company when it was venture financed, and they kept me as I went into the private equity world. It is a whole new world. This is the first time I've ever seen this, and it's been fascinating and educational to watch how a big private equity firm manages a company that it has majority control over. So Mark is confronted with a board meeting where there's not 3 VCs who each own 20% of the company. There's 6 or 8 guys all representing the same investor who owns you. And it is a very different dynamic. And I think that it presents real challenges for management, and it presents an interesting challenge for the independent director, who really has to recognize that there's an owner sitting around the table, and you really learn the dynamics of the private equity firm itself, and what are the different roles of these people who have been invited onto the board. And some are very, very operational, and others are making decisions. And it is a very different game, to say the least. And I don't think Mark or I have it quite figured out yet. So we're still working on that one.
Seems you could get Mark to hire one of your relatives so you could become conflicted, and then you could find a way to go.
Well, okay, Rod. So one of the questions that came up here says, who has responsibility for managing conflict among investors who are on the board, and how does that, and who does handle this type of conflict?
So I'll start it. For me, and I get that from time to time because there's 4 of them. I end up mediating. I do have one investor who I think the other ones really respect. Very calm, even-keeled personality. Thinks before he talks, which is sort of unique in that market a little bit, and he helps. He's actually quite useful because there are times when I'm like, I'm gonna hit somebody. So why don't you go soften him up, and then I'll come talk to him. But I think I've got a new independent who I actually think could be good at that. Yeah. He's not been on the board quite long enough yet that he doesn't have the deep relationships with them that he needs, but I think that's a big deal, mediating the differing opinions.
Good.
Yeah, I think Rod's point there is having a good working relationship amongst the board helps a lot with those things, because there's going to be disagreements and there's going to be tense discussions, and that's normal and that's fine. So if there's good trust and relationships among the board members, that's where you can really be effective. And it just takes time to build that. And that's one of the things I think you have to be focused on when you join as an independent, is you've got to get those relationships set up and help foster that.
Like, I think everybody wants to be heard. I think at the end of the day, you've got to create an environment where there's plenty of time for people to have opinions, and then you've eventually got to agree to disagree sometimes, and kind of get people leaning on making the final decision and let's go, and then we're moving on.
So, I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think that, from my perspective, at the end of the day, the responsibility for managing these conflicts rests with the CEO. It is really his job, but an independent director can be hugely helpful in refereeing those disagreements. I have another written question, then we'll come to you next. This I thought was really good. I hadn't thought about this one before. Can you describe the agenda for an investor-driven board meeting, and how are those board meetings structured? I should ask Mark to answer this one, but I'll let Rod go.
Yeah, so the things that they want to talk about, I think some are quite obvious, but they want to know, are you selling stuff, right? Have you sold what we thought we were going to sell? Therefore, that means we get to bill and collect and pay the bills. How much cash is in the bank? How much cash goes out the door every day that you don't replace with billings? How long until you're out of cash? So it's like, are you selling stuff, and where's the cash position? And once you get those two things out of the way, you spend a lot of time talking about the competitive environment and the product, and who's our biggest competitor, and are we winning 8 out of 10 or 2 out of 10? And then we spend time talking about the leadership team. That's the meat of sort of the agenda. We obviously, periodically have to pop off and look at comp or things like that. But I think it's mostly, are you selling stuff? What's the cash position? How are we competitively? Do we still feel the market's where the market is? What's our growth rate? Those are the things you're looking at. You're from an investor board perspective. When might we need to raise money again? Are we ready to do that? Who would we raise it from? Those type of things.
Yeah, and product in the company I'm working at, we're early and evolving. So a lot of it also is about the updates to product builds and how the engineering team's doing.
Yeah, I think my experience would suggest that directors would always like to see more time devoted to strategy, but unfortunately, much of the board meeting is devoted to an operations review. So, if you step back, whether public or private, and look at the amount of time invested in board meetings over the course of a year to strategic considerations versus tactical, it's far too skewed on the tactical side. So there's really a need in terms of agenda setting for either private or public company boards to carve out enough time for strategic deliberation versus just reporting the numbers. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, that question led really well into the concern I was going to bring up. But I serve on a publicly traded board, a large nonprofit, and then a small private company that's investor-driven, and I'm one of 2 independent directors. The concern over the investments doesn't leave much time for asking questions about our people, our leadership, our culture, and are people behaving well here? Mm-hmm. And I've read a lot of articles, I'm sure you have too, about small startups imploding due to bad behavior inside those companies. So I'm wondering if you have those concerns, and how, I'm not a shy person, so I'm bringing them up, and most of the issues occur because we're running by the seat of our pants, so we're going to give everybody a raise. Is that okay? And then I say, no, we need to have a compensation committee meeting and decide that with the independent directors on the call, and those kinds of things. But if I weren't there, I wonder what might happen. So it's a concern that I have.
Yeah, Libby, I think that's right. What has been interesting to me in my current role is some of those business principles that I think a lot of us would find common are foreign in some discussions, and so you do. I think I think that's one of the key benefits of bringing in an independent director is you do bring some different perspectives, some more knowledge, some business acumen to the table, and help you get through things like that, which may avoid a disaster inside the company. So I do think that's important, and to really you and Bill's point, having those strategic discussions is really critical and often neglected, or shoved to the back of the agenda, and you run late and you don't spend enough time on it. So that would be one piece of advice I would give for sure, is make sure there's time devoted to it so that you don't run into bad situations.
I sit on multiple types of boards too, and I would say that the amount of time spent on people, strategy compared to cash sales, EPS variations, what we're telling the street, what we're not telling, just whatever the tactical quarterly activities are. And this is everything from little to public. To your point, Bill, we spend, single-digit % of the time on strategy, people, culture, how we're building the company, and 90+% of the time on 19 slides on how many different ways we could talk about the EPS next quarter. Which I really want to slit my wrist on the 14th slide. Yeah. Because this has nothing to do with managing the business, frankly, as a board member. As the independent who's an operator, I get no energy from that. So can we start talking about the business and the people and the markets and what are we doing? But we seem to never get to that. It's tricky.
I'm surprised you made it to slide 14 before you want to slit your wrist.
I might have had my phone on, which kept me occupied.
Okay, any other audience questions? We are reaching toward the end of our time here. Let me wrap up with kind of a summary opportunity for the panelists here. Let's take all that we've talked about today and try to define or suggest what would distinguish a really great independent board member from just an average one. How would you view a differentiator in terms of service as an independent director?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, again, I think a lot of the stuff I've said today, which or all of us have said today, is bringing in some different business experience or expertise, being a part of a team and helping the team be functional and being a functional member of the team, and then making sure that you're there and willing to step up and mediate or have those difficult decisions or discussions that will come along the path with you, and then be a support to the CEO. That role is very complex. It's it's a difficult one. There's a lot on the CEO's plate, and so for you to be an asset that they can call for help, call for advice, or be a support in any other way, I think is really a critical piece of your job as an independent. And of course, watching out for the business.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that. I think you could almost gauge how much you're helping by how many times the CEO calls you between board meetings. Or emails you, or Slacks you, or texts you, or direct message you on Twitter, or what your favorite communication channel is. But how, so there's, I think there are directors that are very useful board meeting to board meeting, and they're helpful during that time, and they can help solve problems and give you interesting input. But when the board meeting's over and you go back to work the next day, am I going to call you because I think there's something you can help me with, whatever it is, right? That happens to not be related to the board cycle. And to me, that's, and it could be something as simple as, I don't know this person, could you introduce me, please? Or as complex as, I need to hire a new CMO, would you help me run the interview process, right? So it's, so it's those type of value adds that I think are really important to the CEO. Or it could be, I've got to align a disparate group of investors on a topic, can you help me do that? So I think if the phone's not ringing in between board meetings, you should find a way to help it ring, I think, if you're sitting in an independent role.
So I find it fascinating that totally independently, we all have the exact same answer. I believe an independent director owes a huge responsibility to the CEO to be an advisor, coach, available, helping, right up to the day that you decide you have to fire him. But until you make that decision, I think that director's responsibility is to the CEO, and you really do everything in your power to help make that individual successful, because if he's successful, the company is usually succeeding as well, and it's in everybody's best interest. So I think with that, we would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and we will wrap up the panel and turn things back over to Ralph.
Now, I'd like to talk to you for just a minute or two. Today is our 8th anniversary. May 9th, 2008 was our first meeting here in Austin. And I'd just like to talk to you for a minute about how we got here, where we are, and give you some good news about where we're going from here. So we really started putting this together in Austin long before that first meeting in 2008. In the early 2000s, NACD didn't think we were ready. They said, well, you're on our radar, but you're not there yet. And we didn't want to wait. So through IC Squared, the Think and Do tank at UT, we put together 3 conferences on corporate governance for early stage companies: Austin, Houston, and Dallas, 2005 through 7. In the meantime, NACD started in Houston. It was called NACD Houston then. And we invited NACD to partner with us. And they did. It was a great partnership, and we were really successful. And then in 2007, NACD Houston had the rights, if you will, to Austin and San Antonio. And they called and said, can we do this? And we said, we're ready. And here we are. And we launched in San Antonio a couple years later. Our chapter became the Texas TriCities chapter. So that's how we got here. Now, where are we? If you look at our chapter nationally, membership, attendance, sponsorship, programming, we're a leader. Julie is constantly barraged with calls from other chapters. So on the national front, great. At the local level, 3 things we work on: creating a peer-to-peer community for directors. That's you. Promoting best practices in corporate governance, providing hands-on nuts and bolts education by directors for directors. I sure hope you saw that today. I did. And I hope you experience all 3 of those things every time we're together. So I had a director from another chapter call me. He was just so surprised by our success in Austin. And he asked me why, and I gave him the same answer I'm giving you now. It's you, our members, it's our staff, and our advisory board. The one thing I never anticipated is that I would still be chair 8 years in, but we're going to fix that today. Rick Ponton is becoming our incoming chair. When we reconvene in September, he will be your chair. So Rick has been CEO, chairman, president, or COO, or some combination of thereof for all of the following: AirClick, Tango, Track Wireless, Cincinnati Bell. And that's not mentioning his roles at AT&T, Sprint, and MCI. He's an NACD Governance Fellow, Board Governance Fellow. He's a longtime advisory board member. He's a terrific leader, a good guy, and a great dad. And I think that last point says more about him than anything else. So with that, please join me in welcoming Rick as our new chair.
Thank you very much. The speaker working? Okay, thank you very much for that. That was wonderful, particularly that last comment about being a dad, because I have a 20-year-old and I have a 16-year-old, and right now I think my 20-year-old is wonderful, and I'm ready to shoot my 16-year-old. So, and I'm sure we've all been through that on some level or another. I heard the laughter, undertone of laughter here, so some of you are experiencing the same thing right now. Thank you so much, number one, for choosing me to succeed you. I'm humbled by it. You've done a terrific job for us and leading us and all the different things that we've accomplished and achieved over all the years. So, you know, just a deep, grateful thanks from me to you for everything you've done and for picking me in this role. You know, I was thinking about what I might say when I stand up here. And I know I'm between you in your busy days, and I thought maybe what Ralph would do is start talking about all the numbers of how we started with 0 members, and now we've got this number of members, and we've got this full boards, and we've got all these meetings, and who comes to them. Lots of stats, right? Because that's what CEOs do, right? They do stats. So, but then and I was going to say something on top of that, and then he didn't go there at all. And he kind of took what I was going to say about him away a little bit, but I want to reinforce what I was thinking, and that is I had a mentor 15, 20 years ago. And one of the things that he used to say to me was, Rick, look, you can achieve this, you can get this done, you know, you can have these people go on and do this, your company can be this, and you can be to that, they can do that. But 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, you're not going to remember any of those numbers. You're only going to remember the people and who you interacted with, who you had coffee with, who you shared things with, who would buy you a beer, who you could talk to. And, you know, and that's what you remember. And that's what I remember, I will remember, even though he's not gone away, that's what I will remember most about Ralph, is the relationship and the people and the way that he connected with all of us, and we're all the better for it. So, before we end the session, Ralph, you're not getting away without a little bit of a going away gift, and you're standing in front of it.
I tried so hard to nip this in the bud.
I know, he totally did this. All right. So from your friends in our chapter here in Houston and in corporate, we give this to you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your years of service.
Thank you.
And look forward to working with you in the future.